So I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for tonight, Michelle Place. She is the Executive Director of the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum. She has been in this role since 2012. She is also a two-time Emmy-winning documentary writer, technical advisor, and producer. Her first film was in 2016 called Boomtown: An American Journey. And then in 2020, she produced Le Door of a Door, Generation to Generation, Tulsa's Jewish Community. In 2018, she was named as one of 35 global women drivers for peace. And she's a native of Little Rock, but she's lived in Tulsa for 34 years. So Michelle, welcome to our library.
Thank you.
We're so glad you can be with us tonight.
I'm very honored, and I'm so impressed with what your library is doing and being available in so many different ways. Good job. Good job.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn off my camera and my microphone, and I'm going to turn things over to you. But if anyone has questions in the chat, I will be monitoring that.
Good. I guess in some respects that I sort of made a duh kind of question and asking about last summer. I think for those of us who live in Tulsa, we kind of, that's our world, and we do not really have a sense of how much of the rest of the world is watching what's happened. Although we articulate that periodically, but sometimes we kind of forget. So yes, that's right. It was a big deal when President Trump was going to come on Juneteenth last summer. And then of course with George Floyd, and Tulsa certainly has had our own share of young African Americans who have been the subject of police brutality. And so that's something that's very much in the forefront of our community. Well, tonight I'm really excited to share with you, to educate about this community that I am so passionate about. Tulsa's history, Oklahoma's history, is very, very complicated, and it's also very unique. And parts of Oklahoma are unique to one another. But what is not unique is, let me see if this will work, if I'll go to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. We like to say that the past causes the present and affects the future. So that's what I'd like to share with you tonight is it's not enough to say, I want to know about May 31st and June 1st of 1921. The story's complicated, and there were so many straws that were placed in the basket of that camel until one finally broke that back. So let's begin. You have to go all the way back to the Louisiana Purchase. So here's a map to remind us all. Oklahoma's permanent settling was put in motion by the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, also by Western migration, manifest destiny, and the desire of the common man to own his own land. What we now know as the state of Oklahoma is right here in the center. Get your bearings there. It was all of this land, the Louisiana Purchase, of course, purchased from France by Thomas Jefferson, the federal government, in 1803. Well-known Indian nations roamed certainly throughout all of this section of the Americas, but the Apaches, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux, and other tribes followed these buffalo herds who were roaming through this far western plains. But for our purposes, we will focus predominantly on the nomadic Osage tribe, who also followed the buffalo herds, but they ventured more also all the way into Illinois and into Indiana. Now, please turn your thoughts to the southeastern United States, to this area. This is where what we refer to as the 5 civilized tribes lived. So the 5 civilized tribes were Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. The 5 tribes, let me go back, I'm not ready for that slide yet. These 5 tribes were much more agrarian as opposed to nomadic. They received the moniker civilized because of their relationship with Europeans. They lived in more permanent housing and villages, and they grew crops as opposed to following buffalo herds and taking their homes, tents, teepees, while hunting. These tribal members married Europeans. They transacted business with Europeans, and they also adopted Indians and non-Indians into their tribes, and sometimes they made slaves of them. They also took into their communities many freed and runaway slaves, and often they made slaves of both blacks and whites, generally when they were conquered in battle. They also married and they had children with each of these groups. Like all Indian nations, the 5 civilized tribes had their own governments, and within their individual tribes, they had clans. And so also many differences. A word of caution here. You absolutely cannot paint with a broad brush, even with these tribes, except for maybe one thing. And that would be the idea of land ownership. The land belonged to the tribe and not to the individual. Now we'll see this structure collapse, and it has a major effect on Oklahoma in just a few minutes. So here's a map of Oklahoma. Here is what we call Oklahoma Territory, and then also Indian Territory. If you're familiar with our state, Interstate 35 runs right through the middle of the state. That is a defining boundary, but we refer to Eastern Oklahoma and also to Western Oklahoma. So there are 2 very distinct regions as originally set up by the federal government. Many folks know about the Oklahoma land runs of 1889 and 1891, but please note that these famous land runs have absolutely nothing to do with Indian Territory. They took place in Oklahoma Territory, and that is a separate way of dealing with the land. The land run of 1889 also brought many persons of color who were looking to homestead, to own their own lands, and to escape the sharecroppers' way of life, and certainly of Jim Crow oppression. Oklahoma represented the hope for peace and prosperity, particularly for African Americans. They came by wagons, they came by foot, and they came on horseback. For this evening's purposes, please turn your attention just to Indian Territory. So let's go back to the 1830s. Let's see if this works. And there's President Andrew Jackson, who signed the Indian Removal Act on May 28th of 1830. The federal government wanted the land in the southeastern United States for the expansion of European settlements and ultimately for prosperity. Anyone who was not of European descent was considered to be lower on the organizational chart of who was the most important and who had value. Today, we would use the terms white supremacy and white privilege. Within the individual tribes, there were differing opinions held by clans or the villages as to whether they should move to Indian Territory or whether they should stay in the southeastern United States. Many refused to leave because this was the land of their ancestors and they were willing to fight and to die for it. Others only wanted to live in peace and they were willing to move. They saw the European domination on the horizon. So some villages left before the forced removal, or what we call the Trail of Tears, and this is Tulsa's story. It was the Lakapoka village in northern Alabama who brought their coals from their ceremonial fires, and they kept the coals glowing on the journey to Indian Territory, and then relit that fire in what was to become Tulsa, Oklahoma. In the 1830s, it was the Lewis Perryman family who built log cabin and a trading post and established a foothold in what was to become the Muskogee Creek Indian Territory. Perryman was part Creek, and when you look at some family photos of them, it is easy to tell that many of them are of African descent. Now, I do not have a picture of the Perryman family um, because when we had an exhibit and I had one in mind, it was on loan from us from the Perryman family. So what I've tried, this is a side note, what I've tried to do in tonight's presentation is to only use photographs or maps that are in our collection. Okay, so I'm sorry that I don't have that photograph of the Perrymans to show you. So let's look at the forced removal or the Trail of Tears from 1831 to 1842 and how all of these tribal members made their way on this forced march. Now, one of the things that stood out to me the most when I first saw this is the Seminole from Florida. And look how they came to Oklahoma across the Gulf of Mexico in the belly of a ship, and then into New Orleans, and then ultimately to march to make that walk into Oklahoma. This is a very complicated story, and like some of the others, it deserves a scholarly program of its very own. Again, you cannot paint with a broad brush, but suffice it to say that many who did walk that Trail of Tears were destitute and they were ill, and so many did die along the way. But some who came, whether freely before the forced removal or on the Trail of Tears, brought with them wealth and also many home furnishings. Also included among these 5 tribes were slaves. All 5 civilized tribes were slavers. So slavery becomes very problematic during the Civil War. There were tribes that began to have internal conflicts as to whether or not they would side with the Confederacy because they wanted that protection because they were slavers and they didn't want to give up that way of life. There were also clans or villages who believed that it would be the North who would prevail, and so they wanted to go with the Union Army. We also saw many tribal members swapping sides, particularly from the Confederacy to the Union, when it was more clear who would prevail in the Civil War. And again, living in peace was the ultimate goal. We come to emancipation when Lincoln freed the slaves, and that's another place that you, again, can't paint with a broad brush because of the different treaties that had been signed with the federal government. Some tribal persons of African descent were seen as still being members of the Indian tribes, while in some tribes they were not. Therefore, some African descendants were caught in a no man's land. They were neither Indians nor were they seen as American citizens by the United States government. This is a very complicated story, and it also deserves a story of its own. But for our purposes tonight, let's now focus on the Osage, the Cherokee, and the Creek. Okay, so here's somewhat of a blurry picture of the tribal lands, and where I have put this X right here is where the Osage, the Cherokee, and the Creek all come together. Now, this is on the northwest corner of downtown Tulsa. We have a monument which marks the spot. Well, actually, it used to be a little bit farther east, and the interstate came through there, so they moved the monument. But nevertheless, this is the only place where 3 tribes come together. Let me say a word just for a moment about the Osage. They were not part of the 5 civilized tribes, but their lands were affected and were reduced because, and to be a part of Indian territory. Now, you may have read or be familiar with The Flowers of the Killer Moon, which is part of the Osage story. Martin Scorsese is getting ready to film in Osage County. So the Osage also ended up with some oil money, but that's another whole story, another whole program that I could do for you. But for now, let's turn our focus just to the Cherokee Nation and also to the Creek Nation. Post-Civil War became the age of the cowboy and of the cattle drives. Now, probably the most famous cattle drive is the Chisholm Trail, and that's really farther west from Indian Territory. It would have come from Wichita Falls and then on up through Oklahoma to Dodge City, Kansas, and then railroads are continuing the cattle drives into Kansas City. Oops, let me go back. I missed one. Okay. In August of, no, I was right. Sorry. Here's a picture of some cowboys, and I'm going to let you in on a little secret about these cattle drives. Many of the cowboys who were driving the cattle north were of African descent, freed slaves, runaways, many of them, and also a large number of them were Mexican. Now, generally, the trail boss would have been a white man, but not always, but that often happens. So there are some of our cowboys in Oklahoma driving the cattle. Okay. Now let's talk about the railroad. So herds of cattle were driven from Texas across the Red River and continued on that trail north into Indian Territory. So it was the coming of the railroad south and westerly, and I want you to follow this line that comes out of southwestern Missouri and down into Veneta, and then is extended to the Arkansas River. So right in this area, okay? In August of 1882, the Frisco Railroad is extended all the way to the Arkansas River in order to service this cattle industry. The Hall brothers, James N. and Harry C., operated a company store which provided goods for those who were building the railroad. And then they were assigned the duty of selecting a site for a permanent railroad depot. With first, the Hall brothers set a place in what is more in Cherokee Nation. But it didn't take them long to discover that the Creeks were far more amenable to trading with the white man. There were fewer restrictions for these white businesses to operate in the Creek Nation. So the future town site was moved just a few miles southerly and to the west. J.M. Hall is who we consider to be the father of Tulsa. He's the one that laid out our first street and set up his tent along where the railroad would come through, and he sold ginger snaps out of a barrel. How's that? Okay, let's focus on Oklahoma Black towns. Black entrepreneur, a man named J.B. Stratford, arrived in Tulsa in 1889. I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. I'm so sorry. I hate it when I got these pages out of order. Okay, so here we go. From 1865 until 1920, African Americans created more than 50 towns in what is now the state of Oklahoma. The all-Black towns began in Indian Territory just after the Civil War, when the former slaves of the 5 civilized tribes decided to settle together for mutual protection and also for economic security. Oklahoma was said to be a land of promise and a safe haven for these African Americans. Many of these towns were short-lived due to the migration to larger cities for economic opportunities, but also a lot of it had to do with education systems for better schools. And so, with that migration to the larger communities, there was a declining tax base. And so, many of these towns became abandoned, although many of them still survive today. One of that I'm very fond of is Langston, right here in the center of the state. And that is where our first historically Black college and university is still thriving today, Langston University. Bowley is a town, it's right here in the center, is a community that is still thriving today. And of course, Muskogee, Taft, all in this area are still thriving. Let's move to the Dawes Act of 1887. This is former Senator Dawes. It was this act that truly changed Indian Territory forever. The act authorized the federal government to break up tribal lands by partitioning them into individual plots, or the word that we use is allotments. The objective of that Dawes Act was to assimilate Native Americans into American society by annihilating their culture and their social traditions. So Indian children were sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native languages. They had to learn to speak English. Another thing that they really lost was their style of art. They were forced to accept European and American ways of drawing. And fortunately, the language and that form of art are making a comeback, but it certainly was lost for a long time. Allotments really meant that the land could be bought and sold. So one of the ramifications of this Dawes Act was that it destroyed that concept of land ownership, where the land belonged to the tribe and not to the individuals. Again, be careful about that paintbrush, because each tribe was treated differently depending upon the original treaty that they had signed with the federal government. Some tribes, as heads of household, were received as much as 160 acres. A single person over the age of 18 might receive 60 acres or 80 acres, and then someone under 18 might receive 40 acres. But in some tribes, there were equal allotments to all persons within that tribe. And in some cases, the allotments might not even be joined. A child's allotment could be miles and miles away from the allotments of his parents. Some tribes were allocated land based on the quality of the land. Did it have water? Was it good for farming, or was it just on a rocky hillside? That all made a difference. But with individual land ownership came taxes. Think what it meant for a people who, for generations upon generations upon generations, had always transacted business through a barter system, through trading. Think how many people would have been cheated out of their land, ultimately having the chance to build wealth through land ownership. There are horrible, horrible stories about how Indians were cheated out of their land. One in particular is through burials. The town councils, many of them passed um, um, regulations that said you could no longer bury your dead, you couldn't bury your grandmother in your family cemetery on your land, that a person now had to be buried within a cemetery, a designated place. And of course, there were all kinds of rules and regulations that would have come with that. So the funeral director would have said to the family, it will be X amount of dollars. The family replies, we don't have any money. the funeral director says, don't worry about it. If you'll just sign right here, it'll be a loan. In essence, it's a lien on your property. And when your peach crop comes in next spring and you sell it, then you can pay off grandmother's burial. Well, of course, when the peach crop was sold, there was no more money then than there was back when the grandmother had died. And so at that point, because of the lien, the land would have reverted to the funeral director, who would have either kept it or sold it on to some other person and made money off of it. So that's just one of the examples of how these native peoples could have been cheated out of their lands. This safe haven of Oklahoma, specifically Greenwood, was especially appealing to an oppressed people. Here is a picture of O.W. Gurley, and we're going to talk about J.B. Stratford in a minute. But J.B. Stratford arrived in Tulsa in 1899, and he believed that Black people had a much better chance of economic progress if they would pool their resources and that they would support one another's businesses. So Stratford bought a large tract of real estate in the Cherokee allotments, and then he subdivided that land and then sold it only to Black persons. He then built a hotel and some other businesses. And things change again. It was 1901 that oil was discovered just across the Arkansas River, and by 1905, the Glenpool oil field had been discovered. And that's the one that truly made Tulsa the oil capital of the world. The Glenpool field truly was the largest field in the world. That's really hard for us to believe. It was drained very quickly. You can see by this photograph how close all of these oil derricks are. And so a lot of people made money very quickly, but that field didn't last long. It was within the Creek Nation. And so these persons who had Creek allotments received a lot of that oil revenue. Okay. It's also at this time that flyers and newspaper articles, advertisements are going to the southeastern United States in particular, but also all over the country, advertising that that Oklahoma Indian Territory would be a great place for African Americans to settle. And so Greenwood becomes settled. These Greenwood boundaries, it's 36 square blocks. There's Pine Street to the north, Cincinnati to the west, Archer on the south, and then Lansing on the east. And those are easy for us to identify still today. O.W. Gurley was a wealthy Black landowner from Arkansas, and he had first participated in the 1889 land run, and then he made his way to Tulsa and to Greenwood in 1906. He purchases about 40 acres, which also was only to be sold to Black folk. Gurley built a rooming house of two-story buildings and 5 residences. And he also founded today what was the Vernon AME Church, a Black Masonic lodge, and he also had an employment agency. So like J.B. Stratford, O.W. Gurley, African Americans began to come en masse to Tulsa's Greenwood. So when you're just a couple of generations past emancipation, you're descendants of former slaves, what is it that is the most important to you? When you were a slave, your family certainly could have been sold off. So you want to keep that family together, and you have dreams of being able to support them. When you've been denied the right to read, you want to get an education. And then you want to own your own land, and you want to decide your own destiny. So word begins to spread about the plethora of possibilities which could be had by Black Americans who had been living under oppression. So many who came to Greenwood were professionals. They had received educations from Howard and Spelman and Fisk University and other historically Black colleges and universities. They were physicians and dentists and pharmacists and teachers and real estate brokers and funeral directors. It wasn't long in the Greenwood district before we see the rise of beauty parlors and barber shops, and then grocery stores and restaurants, dress shops, pool halls, and yes, even movie theaters, the Dreamland movie theater. Of course, this is, I'll go back. These are the boundaries of the Greenwood district. And I'm going to come back to this photograph in just a few minutes. Of course, many of the residents of Greenwood were also working as bellhops and ushers in Tulsa's fabulous, magnificent movie houses and their hotels. And of course, they worked as domestics in the homes of the rich white oil families that oil money had built. There were also day laborers and oil field roustabouts and shoe shine boys and other domestics. It was in 1907 when the Twin Territories became one Oklahoma. And the very first law that was passed by the legislature were Jim Crow restrictions. Oklahoma's Jim Crow laws were some of the harshest in all of the country. Greenwood thrived and became to be known as Black Wall Street. The community prospered because residents of Greenwood could not spend their money for goods or services south of the tracks. So here is the Frisco Railroad. We talked about that earlier with when it had to do with the cattle drives and the settling of Tulsa. So here is Greenwood, which is barely in the Cherokee Nation. So the Cherokee and the Creek borders run right through here. Vernon AME Church today, its address is 314 North Greenwood, and that is just 3 blocks inside of the Cherokee Nation. So Greenwood resides in the Cherokee, not in the Creek Nation. Each Thursday evening was a cause for celebration because that was the night off for the domestics who worked in all of the rich white families on the south side of town. So again, this Frisco Railroad is what delineates North Tulsa from South Tulsa. North Tulsa being predominantly African American, South Tulsa predominantly white. So it was a great time of celebration on Thursday evenings. These domestics and other workers would come with their pay in hand, and they would spend it in the Greenwood district. Those who worked outside the district would bring new money into Greenwood. Every dollar spent in Greenwood is said to have changed hands no less than 19 times before it would leave the district. Greenwood prosperity. I would love to show you photographs of what Greenwood looked like before this tragic event of May 31st, 1921, but everything was destroyed. And also people didn't have, in essence, Kodak Insta cameras. It would have been portraits that would have been made by professional photographers. And so often I get asked from media nationally and internationally, or someone doing their genealogical research, and they want one of those photographs. We simply don't have them because they would have been destroyed. But it was in the earliest 20th century that many Black Wall Street citizens lived in beautiful multi-story brick homes that were full of musical instruments and fine furniture and crystal and china. Many of the residents of Greenwood wore fur coats. They also drove automobiles. Now, that's not true for all residents of Greenwood, but it certainly was true for a lot of them. Basically, inside the Greenwood district, life was really good. But outside the district, that was where whites set the rules. Let's move ahead to 1917 through 1919 and World War I and the impact that that had. Here you see a Tulsa or a Greenwood resident who had come home and showing very proudly his World War I uniform. The United States entered World War I, the war to end all wars, in April of 1917. African Americans from Oklahoma was the largest ethnic group per capita to volunteer to serve their country in World War I. These Greenwood soldiers were sent mostly to northern France, and they participated in the very last days of the final push in the victory over Germany in 1919. So in Europe, these soldiers were seen as saviors and as heroes, and they were honored, they were revered. But when they returned to their homes, they returned to Jim Crow and being seen as lower than any white person. They were less than the least on the scale of humanity. The summer of 1919 was called Bloody Summer, as the United States saw the rise of the Klan and lynching of any Black person who seemed to get out of line. There were attacks on persons of color all over the country. So in this 1917 to 1919, these were riots or attacks on these persons of color. East St. Louis, Illinois, Houston, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, Washington, D.C., Omaha, Nebraska, and Elaine, Arkansas. Here's our Williams family, some of the most prosperous in the Greenwood district. The Williams family owned lots of businesses, but they were best known for the Dreamland Theater. Mrs. Williams, who ran the theater, also had a sweet shop and bakery, and then Mr. Williams opened up a garage where automobiles could be fixed. And there were lots of white owners of automobiles who would cross the tracks and bring their vehicles to Mr. Williams to prosper or to have their automobiles fixed. So now let's focus on May 30th of 1921. Socioeconomics also played a role in keeping Blacks in their places. Imagine a white man might do who has not achieved a level of economic success to which he felt that he was entitled. How much jealousy and how much hatred could have been in his heart. Imagine this man looking across the tracks to Black Wall Street and seeing those fine, beautiful homes, automobiles, fur coats, successful businesses. He probably would say to himself, they shouldn't have those things. I don't have those things. I deserve them. It's not right. It was Memorial Day weekend. There were graduation exercises. There was the prom, and the dreams of the future were free flowing all over Tulsa. A 20-year male from Greenwood was working as a shoe shine boy on the white Main Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, located south of the tracks. The young Black man named Dick Rowland entered the Drexel building on Main Street, and it was there he entered the elevator to go to a restroom, which he was able to use, could be used by Negroes. The elevator operator was a young woman by the name of Sarah Page. Sarah had come to Tulsa a few months before to go to business college. We don't know exactly what happened, what would cause Sarah Page to scream and therefore call attention to her supposed assailant, Dick Rowland. Some surmise that Mr. Rowland stepped on her foot, that the elevator was just a little bit off and it jerked and he fell into her. Some surmise that he grabbed her arm, and then others went so far as to say that he had raped the young woman. Again, we don't know exactly what happened. Mr. Rowland did exactly what any Black man of the time would have done. He fled. And it was the news of the assault began to spread, and Rowland was arrested in Greenwood, and he was subsequently taken to the city jail, which was located at the county courthouse, again, in the white section of town. So here are several articles that were in both of our newspapers, the Tulsa World as well as the Tulsa Tribune, that helped to spread the story, to exaggerate, to inflate maybe what had happened. An inflammatory front page news story appeared May 31st in the afternoon edition of the Tulsa Tribune, and then it spurred a confrontation between Black and white armed mobs around the courthouse and the jail. A group of Greenwood residents, many of them were these former World War I veterans, went to the courthouse to demand the release of Dick Rowland into their protection. And they were afraid that a white mob would lynch Dick Rowland. The sheriff and his men had barricaded the top floor of the courthouse, and in order to protect Dick Rowland, the sheriff assured the crowd that Rowland was safe, and he asked these Greenwood residents to return to their homes and businesses north of the tracks. As the afternoon drug on, the white mob grew. The news reached Greenwood, and so these residents returned to the courthouse with more people, and a confrontation ensued between the white mob and now this group of residents of Greenwood. There are multiple accounts of what happened. Again, it's one of those things that we really don't know for sure, but in the end, a gun went off and all hell broke loose. The Blacks rushed back to Greenwood to better arm themselves and also to set up a perimeter in which to protect their homes and their businesses. The white mob was right behind them, having increased in numbers and in weapons. And white men of all socioeconomic levels were deputized and had the authority to participate in the mayhem. It was obvious that these African Americans were outmanned and outgunned. And here's the destruction, some of the Greenwood fires. Again, you can see these are the railroad tracks of the Frisco Railroad. And here is a lot of the destruction by the morning of June 1st, 1921. Greenwood had been looted and burned by the white mob. Greenwood residents were shot in their homes. Some were shot in the streets. And first-person accounts describe bombs being dropped from the airplanes that would land on the houses and burn the houses from the top instead of from the inside. Many of these homes were first looted, robbed, and then they were set afire. Ultimately, 35 blocks had been decimated, and it was estimated that as many as 300 people were killed. It's impossible to reach an accurate number for many reasons. Here's some more pictures of the fire and the destruction. This photograph is coming from a view of downtown Tulsa looking to the north. This is Greenwood Avenue. Right here, we know it because of Standpipe Hill, which is still there today. You can still see that. And then the railroad tracks are here on this southern end of the community. Takes your breath away, doesn't it? So many of the residents who were able left town. As I said before, they had automobiles. They could have left on foot. They could have driven away. They could have gone to other communities where they had family. That could have been locally. It could have been to Rentisville or Boley or Muskogee, or maybe they went to Chicago and Detroit, where the Great Migration would have sent many of their relatives and friends. There were reports of bodies being thrown into the Arkansas River. That is certainly an oral history that we want to honor. There are also stories of mass graves being built. We currently have an initiative where we are searching for those mass graves. And that is an ongoing project. I can answer more questions about that after we finish if you like. But nevertheless, because so many people left never to return, and we don't know if bodies were dumped in the river, and we don't know how many would have been in a massive grave. That's why that number is elusive over how many actually died in the massacre. I look at this photograph and I wonder who they are. It's obvious that this young man is carrying his possessions, and some there, I look at the despair on their faces. It's possible that these folks, maybe the women worked as domestics in one of the oil homes, and they were making their way to that home where they would be offered protection and living accommodations. That certainly happened in the community. The National Guard arrived in Tulsa on the afternoon of June 1st, and that's when martial law was declared. And the guardsmen took African Americans out of the hands of the vigilantes and imprisoned them, those who had not already been arrested. So these photographs show you of the African American Greenwood residents who were being marched to detention. There were many who were detained in our convention hall, which is still in Tulsa today. It's called Tulsa Theater. Many went to the ballpark, and there were other smaller detention locations around. This photograph fascinates me because I think it shows you the level of prosperity within the Greenwood community. You can see that this gentleman, and this one are all in suits, where this man is dressed in overalls, so maybe more of a day laborer. And here they're going to the convention hall. This one, I believe, is also, they are going to the convention hall and being detained there. Heartbreaking, isn't it? So it begs the question, was it a riot or was it something else? Well, before we get that, let me go back and talk about something else. When they were in the detention halls, they could only be released into the custody of their white employer, who then had to vouch for them and take responsibility for it. The American Red Cross did come to Tulsa and set up. They took care of the sick and the wounded. They also helped to provide shelter for those who had lost their homes. So they set up lots of individual tents. Now, this happened in May, June, and they lived in the tents all through the cold winter, most of them until the next spring or summer. Another thing happened. The town council said that if you rebuilt in Greenwood, that you had to build a structure which was non-flammable. That meant brick or masonry of some kind. Just in sight of Greenwood was a brick factory, but the problem was they would not sell bricks to any blacks. So these folks, with all of their tenacity, their hard work, their dreams of rebuilding Greenwood, would have to travel either their trucks or automobiles or wagons and mules to as far as Kansas and Arkansas to bring back acceptable building materials to the community. Also, there was the problem of insurance claims. Many of the residents of Greenwood did have insurance, but there was a problem. The insurance companies would not pay off of the claims because it was designated as a riot. Now, today, a riot means tearing up your own stuff, and that is not what happened at all. Let me go to the next slide. Was it a riot or was it something else? Today, we use the word massacre, but other words, pogrom, genocide, and ethnic cleansing is really what took place in Greenwood. Riot was the language of the day. Riot was what was used in the Bloody Summer in 1919. We looked at those other places, Elaine, Chicago, et cetera, et cetera. And so riot was the term. Now, I don't really know if that was intentional by insurance companies to use that kind of language at the time. That's something for a historian to look into. The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre happened because, and this is my opinion and others, white supremacy, the rise of the Klan. Think about those World War veterans who came back where they had been seen as saviors, as real heroes, and then come back to Jim Crow. I think it was jealousy of education and of material goods. Greenwood had one of the finest school systems in the country. There certainly was lots of prosperity. I talked before about all the material goods that were owned by these persons. It also was landlust. When that Frisco Railroad was brought in, when the railroad depot was built, we had the cattle industry, but now we have oil that's discovered beginning in 1901, 1905, and it continues. And so it's that railroad that is of great value to get products to other parts of the country. Manufacturing is also rising at the time. And so we want to get other commodities as well as manufactured goods via railroad to other parts of the country. And so if Greenwood was abutted those Frisco Railroad tracks, that was a very valuable land for many. As I stated, many Greenwood residents left Tulsa never to return, but more people decided that they would rebuild. The real story of Greenwood is the spirit of that community. In the face of devastation of their community, the people of Greenwood showed courage and tenacity and hard work, and they dreamed really big dreams of a thriving community. They wanted for their families and their descendants the very best of education, of churches, of businesses to be prosperous. Oops. Come on, change. Here's Greenwood. What most people don't know.
Michelle, and I think you may have turned off your camera by accident.
I did. Okay, well, we can just keep going. Can you see the pictures?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll just keep going. You don't need to see me. Okay, so Greenwood was completely rebuilt by 1925. I mean, think about that. In light of those building restrictions, those building codes, that by 1925, Greenwood is back better than ever, and how this community rose from the ashes. Greenwood's best days were really in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And this is a place where music really thrived. The Tulsa sound was born of a mixture of Negro spirituals, the blues, and jazz. And here we were, located halfway between Kansas City and New Orleans. And that's what really helped to put Tulsa on the music map. The demise of Greenwood came about in the 1960s. Many of the original entrepreneurs were retiring, were dying off, and their children had gotten other educations, had other businesses, and perhaps they had also moved off too. But it was desegregation that really brought about the demise of Greenwood. And with the civil rights movement, African Americans were then able to take their dollars out of the Greenwood district and purchase goods and services south of the tracks. It also was possible with desegregation for African Americans to then move to other parts of the city. And then came urban renewal, or as some people call it, urban removal. Interstate 244 comes right through the heart of Greenwood today. Today, there isn't much left of Greenwood, but there is much to feel and there's much to hear if you listen closely with your heart. As you walk the streets, you can see in the sidewalks plaques where thriving businesses once stood. Let your imagination wander and listen for the voices of the people. We must educate all people and tell the stories of Greenwood. We must lift up their accomplishments so that future generations can learn the lessons and the value of hard work, tenacity, courage to take that step to move into the next moment. With these stories in our hearts and in our minds, we can all meet the future. The past causes the present and affects the future. If you want more information, you certainly are welcome to go to our website, www.tulsahistory.org. Every photograph, every document, every oral history, anything that we have in our collection that has to do with Greenwood, the race massacre, is available for viewing by searching our collection. It really is a place where the national and the international media have gone and for resources, also historians or even school children. I will warn you that many of the photographs within that collection are horrific. They are horrific. There is a disclaimer on there, but that's a good place. There are also lots of links for to other programs, a book list, etc. So with that, I am happy to take any questions that you might have. I'll see if I can turn my video back on.
There you go. Now we can see you again.
Yeah, so I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michelle, for a really thoughtful presentation and just explaining to us kind of the history and how it got to where it did. And I guess one thing I did want to ask you just really quickly before we get to some questions, you mentioned that there is in honor of the kind of anniversary, there is a memorial or a building being built currently in Tulsa. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. There is what we call the 1921 commemorative commission, or the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Commemorative Commission. That's a lot of words to put on a letterhead. And that is composed of just a number of different entities within Tulsa and beyond who are interested in telling the story in one way or another. And out of that came what will be a permanent facility called Greenwood Rising. In some respects, it is a museum, but it's also an interactive experience, if you will. When you walk in, there will be a timeline for the last 400 years of Africans first coming to the Americas, and then it will come down to 1921. You move out of the timeline gallery into the next room, which is a barber shop, because that is a center of community within the African American culture. And so you can sit in a barbershop chair and there will be a hologram of a person telling the story of Greenwood. You move into the next section, which is going to be very horrific. It is as if you are immersed in the middle of the massacre, the gunshots, the fire, et cetera, all done through technology. And then it's very important that the next space is a place of reflection where conversation is encouraged. What did you see? When did you learn? What's changed? What hasn't changed? So we will dedicate the building um, May 31 of 2021, but it won't be open to the public until probably 2022.
It sounds like a pretty,
Yeah.
there's, I mean, a really interesting
Yeah.
project.
Yeah. And Greenwood, and there's a park in there, it's called the John Hope Franklin Park of Reconciliation. And that has now been put on the National Register of the Civil Rights Trail. So we're very excited to have become a part of that in that recent designation.
So we do have some questions here for you. I will go through some of them.
Okay.
Someone would like to know what happened to the men in detention who did not have a white employer. Some might be self-employed or employed by Black people. So then what happened to them?
Okay. Well, after, I believe the longest that anyone was kept in detention was 8 days. And so at that point, and with the martial law, then everyone was released at that point.
I see. Okay. And then there's a question, were any of the white attackers prosecuted? And what happened to the African-American people who were arrested? What was the outcome of this?
Yeah. To this day, there have never been any prosecutions. So that is problematic, certainly. As far as Dick Rowland and Sarah Page, there is also oral history that says they were in a relationship. I have talked to a grandson of a man who worked at a dairy who said that was where Sarah Page and Dick Rowland courted. I have heard that they were about 3 weeks away from moving to California and getting married. We think that Dick was escorted out of the courthouse and was taken to Kansas City. We think that that's where Sarah Page also went. And then the next time we hear about Dick Rowland is that he works in a shipyard in the Northwest, I believe outside of Portland. Don't hold me to that one. But Sarah Page is lost to history, never to be heard of again.
Oh, okay. Let's see, we have lots of nice comments coming through here too. In addition to the questions,
nice.
Lots of nice comments about how informative and just the whole presentation was as good as it gets.
Oh, how very kind. Thank you.
And lots of really nice comments here. There's a question here. Someone would like to know, and let's see if you'll be able to respond to this. Can you speak to the difference in treatment of slaves of American Indians, which were more like indentured servants, versus slaves owned by the plantation owner, who was like kind of considered lifetime slavery?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can speak to that with authority. There certainly are people who can, but what I think it's especially a place you can't paint with a broad brush, how they would have been treated. And many were adopted in and married tribal members, so that would, to me, would not have been the same kind of relationship as what would have been on a plantation.
Someone mentioned that there was an HBO series called Watchmen, where this topic was covered, and that's where some people learned about this topic.
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely. I was fortunate enough to, I never know who's going to be on my phone when I pick that up, but it was one of the producers from Watchmen. And this person was writing for TV Guide. And so they wanted to know my reaction. And I started watching it. And I would say that episode 1, from what I have read, what I know, would be a very accurate portrayal of what really happened. And the Dreamland Theater, you know, where the opening scene and the child and the woman is in there playing the piano. I think that that is all very, very accurate. Now, this is where my personality comes in. When they got into the futuristic stuff and we was going back, and I don't have the kind of mind where I get that. I mean, my life is spent looking back at history. So I don't get Harry Potter. I mean, I just don't understand it. I don't have that kind of brain. I know so many people love it. So anyway, when this reporter from TV Guide asked me about it, and so I was forced to say, I could only watch the first 45 minutes of it. But I think what also really happened was there in front of me on the screen and being immersed in it was so horrific for me that I couldn't watch anymore. So if you haven't seen it, I think you need to be prepared about that. I just don't watch that kind of contemporary violence. It's just too much for me to handle. But I think it really was an accurate portrayal.
There's a comment from someone, and I'm going to ask you a question related to that. The person writes, I polled many of my friends. I grew up in Tulsa, and we never learned about this in school. And so my question for you is this part of the Tulsa curriculum now or Oklahoma curriculum? How is it taught in schools?
Yeah, thank you. It was some years ago that it was, what's the right term? Our legislature said the Tulsa Race Massacre must be taught in Oklahoma schools, in curriculum, public schools. Okay, fine. Well, we have a problem with standardized tests, national tests, which say, or lift up STEM. And when you don't have American history, when you don't have Oklahoma history on a national standardized test, and it's teach for the test, teach for the test, teach for the test, then it's very difficult for this curriculum to be taught over the last few years. I think with the awareness, with the 100th anniversary, and because one of the things that the commission has done has developed curriculum, and we have teachers institutes where we bring teachers in across the state of Oklahoma to learn about it, to learn how to teach it. I also think we're in a new age, and because of 2020 last year, there's much more awareness about social justice issues. So I think some of those things are changing. But let's go back even further, and why didn't I hear about it? I'm from Little Rock. I was born in 1957, and the Little Rock Nine and the integration of Central High School was such a part of my DNA. We all knew about that. I moved to Tulsa in 1986. I had lived here for 15 years. I went to work for the Historical Society February 1st of 2001. My first week, I answer the phone. It's a reporter from New Zealand who says he wants to talk about the Tulsa race riot. Really? So my mind immediately went to 1968 because that was my frame of reference. And so I had no idea that Tulsa had had a race riot and a massacre, especially that magnitude in 1921. So I had some quick learning to do. And then it became apparent that there were so many in Tulsa, and my experience was in the white community who didn't want to talk about such a bad thing. We only wanted to talk about happy history. We only wanted to talk about oil in Tulsa. And so it was very much frowned upon about talking about it. But then more and more people began to find out. So that's the reason we really didn't have it in schools. Now, what was interesting to me was why the Black community was in the same boat in not knowing about this event. And so one of my friends that I've made in the North Tulsa community, I asked her that same question. And she's a descendant of a race massacre survivor. And she had to go to her family, and they had to have a family meeting to say, why didn't we talk about it? And there were several reasons. One is a lot of people who, particularly the men, not all, that's a broad paintbrush, went into a state of depression over it. Also, there was the fear that if it happened once, it could happen again. And then a third concept, which I find very interesting, was that within the African American community, here were these children of promise that they dreamed really big dreams, and you can do anything that you want to do. And so they didn't want to talk about everything that they had achieved being taken away from them, so that it would not inhibit or give these children of promise any idea that there could be anything other than work hard and achieve your dreams. So did that answer the question?
Yeah, it did, but it sounds like the Historical Society at this point is taking a stand where it's really important to reflect and learn what happened so it's not repeated.
It is. And I would say that is most of the work that I am doing these days. You know, we've known that this 100th anniversary was coming, and we've known that the world was watching, and that where is justice, how much has changed, how much has not changed. And of course, there's so many opinions about that. But this institution is very committed to telling all of Tulsa's stories, not just the oil story. And so it is our commitment to tell this Greenwood story.
Someone in the comments made a point about it kind of similar to like Holocaust survivors. Some people just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it with their family. But then there's a lot, but at the same time, there is this feeling of, you know, Holocaust museums are all about making sure people know so that history is not repeated. So
yeah. You know, I have an ongoing conversation with different minority communities, and it's that idea of whose story is it to tell. And I take the position that you know, a lot of people don't want to tell their story, just like you mentioned. And my response is, okay, I hear you. But if you don't tell that story, I, as the white majority, only have the option of hearing the white side of history. And so we have to, and if you receive an email from me, I say that across the bottom, making room to tell all of Tulsa's stories. But I firmly believe that we have to make that space for those stories of minority communities to tell their side of the story. You know, it's not enough just to talk about the plantation owners. I want to hear the slaves. I want to hear what it was really like for them. So part of that is my personality that I bring to the job.
There's a question here from someone who'd like to know if Greenwood was rebuilt a few years later, did the businesses remain Black owned? And what
Yes.
caused the second decline of Black Wall Street or of this community?
Okay. Sadly, if you were to go into Greenwood today, there are just a few blocks of businesses that there are no remaining businesses from pre-1921, except for the Vernon AME Church. And if you'll Google that, you can see the destruction. They were left with just a shell of the building, but that's the only remaining structure from pre-1921. Now, Mount Zion Church was destroyed too, and then it was rebuilt. But no, none of the original businesses, the homes or anything. Through the urban renewal, the land was cleared and taken into the Tulsa Development Authority. Now, Oklahoma State University at Tulsa has a branch, occupies a lot of the land, and there's much discussion today about what will be done with the rest of the land that once was Greenwood.
Well, I hope that with this project, the Greenwood Rising, that it gets a lot of attention, and it's really an important story to tell. And I hope that people all across the country get a chance to really kind of hear this story and shed some light on what happened.
Yeah, yeah. And I invite everyone to come to Tulsa. I'd love for you to come to the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum. We have rotating galleries. There's so many stories to tell about Tulsa. And I think once we pass this 100th anniversary, that much of our community's focus will turn to the Native American story. I think we'll see more and more of that. And within that then is the Freedmen story.
There was another comment here. Someone writes that these stories exist all over the U.S. The same thing happened in Rosewood. An entire Black
Right.
prosperous town was burned down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's lots of nice comments in here. Michelle, I hope you get a chance to kind of scroll through the chat and just see what people have to say. Lots of nice things, though. And
Thank
so I just want to thank you so much for putting together this presentation. I'm so glad, being in this virtual environment, I mentioned to you initially, gave us an opportunity to hear from you, and we never would have been able to hear from you if we were in the library. So there are some small advantages to being in this environment.
Yeah.
And we really are so grateful that we got a chance to hear your story and to hear
It
from
was
you.
my pleasure, and I look forward to visiting your community.
And to everyone who joined us tonight, thank you. We hope that you found the program valuable and interesting, and you walked away, learning about a piece of history that you may not have known much about before. So thanks for joining us tonight.
All right. Thank you. Bye. Come see us.